The messenger probe did not arrive with the fury of an invasion. It arrived with the measured, agonizingly slow grace of a royal procession. It drifted into the primary docking bay of Helios Gate, suspended above the frozen surface of the ice moon Nerith, like a glittering jewel. The Lhoryn Ascendancy had delivered their declaration of war, and they had done so on a slab of luminescent crystalline alloy. It bathed the sterile gray bulkheads of the receiving chamber in a soft, golden light, humming with a frequency that felt less like a threat and more like a holy choir. The translation algorithm took exactly 4 minutes and 20 seconds to decode the glowing script. It was not a demand for unconditional surrender. It was an invitation to a duel. The document, dripping with ceremonial arrogance, laid out the absolute transfer of control over the station and the lucrative trade routes orbiting Nerith. But it was the addenda that truly defined the Lhoryn mind. They had enclosed the strict laws of civilized conflict. Both sides were required to broadcast their exact fleet compositions 72 hours prior to the first strike. Engagements were to be strictly confined to the designated illumination zones of the planetary orbit, areas bathed in starlight to ensure honorable visibility. Hostilities must immediately cease during the 19 minutes of the upcoming total eclipse. Command vessels bearing registered sacred titles were completely immune to direct fire. Any offensive maneuver involving more than 10 capital ships required a formal warning broadcast at least 2 hours in advance. To the Lhoryn, the universe was an orderly place, and slaughter was merely the highest form of etiquette. 50 levels below the pristine diplomatic suite, Silas Kade was covered in aerosolized sealant and industrial grease. He was not an admiral. He had no medals pinned to his chest, nor had he ever commanded a warship. Silas was the chief orbital disaster response architect for Helios Gate. For the past 48 hours, he had not slept. He had been suspended in zero gravity, screaming over an open communications channel as he orchestrated the patching of a massive fracture in the civilian habitation ring, courtesy of an unpredicted micrometeoroid shower. He was exhausted, his muscles aching with the deep, vibrating cold of the outer void. When the summons from the Defense Council came, he was drinking a cup of synthetic coffee that tasted like burnt copper and looking at a holographic stress map of a fractured bulkhead. The council chambers were filled with the terrified murmurs of politicians and the stiff, posturing stances of fleet officers. The projection of the Golden Declaration hovered in the center of the room, casting long shadows across the polished oak table. The commanding officers were already drafting a response. They wanted to rally the remnants of the Outer System Defense Fleet. They wanted to meet the Lhoryn Ascendancy in the designated illumination zones. They argued that fighting by the rules would preserve humanity's diplomatic standing in the wider galactic theater, showing that they, too, were a civilized species, capable of respecting the ancient traditions of starfaring empires. Silas stood at the back of the room, his heavily stained worksuit a stark contrast to the crisp uniforms around him. He did not look at the glowing alien poetry. He looked at the structural schematics of Helios Gate rotating on a secondary monitor. He saw the stress points. He saw the energy grids. He saw the exact mathematical certainty that if humanity placed its fleet inside the neat, theoretical box the Lhoryn had drawn, Helios Gate would be reduced to a cloud of radioactive debris in exactly 3 hours and 45 minutes. He stepped forward, interrupting a high-ranking general's speech on tactical honor. Silas did not raise his voice. He simply stated the facts. The Lhoryn Ascendancy had better ships, thicker armor, and weapons that could melt titanium like wax. But as Silas stared at the golden slab, he realized something profound. The Lhoryn's greatest vulnerability was not their shield harmonic or their engine exhaust. It was their absolute blind faith that every rational species viewed war as a highly choreographed ritual with fixed borders. They expected a duel. They expected rules. They expected a military structure that mirrored their own rigid hierarchy. "We are not sending a fleet," Silas said, his voice carrying the dry, rasping weight of a man who dealt in the physics of collapse, not the glory of combat. If you fight them in the light, you will die in the light. We are going to give them the station. The room erupted. Politicians slammed their hands on the table, and officers accused him of treason. Before the council could order him removed from the chamber, Silas slammed his engineering access terminal onto the glass surface of the briefing table. "I want emergency override control," Silas demanded, cutting through the noise with the authority of a man who knew exactly how the floor beneath their feet was held together. "Not over the defense grids. The Lhoryn will map those in 10 seconds. I want the civilian infrastructure. I want the water reclamation plants. I want the power routing substations. I want the sanitation systems, the transit magnetic levitation rails, the medical synthesis wards, the cargo docks, the deep freeze storage blocks, and every single mile of the pressurized technical tunnels." The council stared at him. They were paralyzed by the sheer absurdity of the request and the looming reality of their own annihilation. They had no other plan, no other fleet capable of reaching them in time. With trembling hands, the station administrator granted him the master access codes. Silas walked out of the room and immediately initiated an order that made the station's military commander threaten him with summary execution. Silas Kade ordered the complete, public dismantling of the station's outer defensive mass driver turrets. Heavy loader drones floated out of the hangar bays, their bright yellow lights flashing against the dark of space. They cut the massive railguns from their moorings, sparking arcs of plasma into the void, and towed them away into the internal cargo holds. Simultaneously, Silas broadcast an unencrypted, system-wide message on all open frequencies, ensuring it would be intercepted, initiating civilian restructuring protocols for mandatory evacuation compliance. All military assets are being powered down to facilitate non-combatant movement. Far out in the black, the sensor sweeps of the Lhoryn Vanguard fleet picked up the activity. Their commanders watched the humans actively disarming their own gateway. The Lhoryn officers smiled in their sterile, perfect command centers. They believed the humans were terrified, stripping their weapons to show compliance, desperately trying to adhere to the rules of surrender before the glorious battle even began. They saw a species yielding to the superior moral and martial law of the Ascendancy. They were entirely wrong. Silas was not stripping the station out of fear. He was unbolting the heavy military hardware because it was draining auxiliary power and locking the station's architecture into a rigid, defenseless posture. By removing the turrets, he was unlocking the heavy structural joints. He was freeing up miles of high-tension power lines that could be routed elsewhere. He was releasing the deep space anchor points that held the rings in a predictable orbit. Beneath the guise of a panicked civilian evacuation, Silas Kade was unbinding the bones of Helios Gate. He was dismantling the static, vulnerable civilian habitat to build something entirely new. The Lhoryn Ascendancy wanted a battlefield with clear borders and predictable targets. Silas was going to make sure the battlefield itself was alive. And it was going to be the most unpredictable, treacherous machine they had ever faced. The exodus began, not with blaring sirens or panicked announcements, but with a silent, synchronized shift in the atmospheric pressure of the station, a subtle signal only the permanent inhabitants understood. Silas Kade directed the true evacuation with ruthless, mathematical efficiency. He bypassed the main concourses entirely, routing the vulnerable down the massive, reinforced elevator tethers toward the sub-glacial bunkers carved deep into the frozen crust of Nereth. Chartered mercantile freighters, hastily stripped of their profitable cargo, became cramped, echoing lifeboats. Priority boarding was not a suggestion. It was strictly enforced by gravity-bolted dock workers. Children, the elderly, the chronically ill, and families with absolutely zero combat training were the first to descend into the cold dark. Silas stood on the observation gantry overlooking the primary tramway, watching thousands of people move with a quiet, terrified discipline. A young, zealous fleet lieutenant, still clinging to textbook tactics, had approached him hours earlier, suggesting they keep a localized civilian population near the outer habitation rings. The lieutenant argued it would deter orbital bombardment, effectively using their own people to buy them time. Silas had physically pinned the man against a steel bulkhead, his forearm pressing hard against the throat of the officer. There would be no human shields. It was the singular, unbreakable moral line he refused to cross. It was imperative that the galaxy understood a fundamental truth. Humanity did not discard the rules of war out of malice or inherent cruelty. They simply refused to march neatly to their own execution, just because the executioner asked politely. As the populace drained away, leaving behind hollowed-out apartments and echoing plazas, the invisible transformation of the station accelerated. Every mundane element of civilian life was systematically weaponized under the relentless directives of Silas. The high-capacity lithium-ion batteries that powered the sprawling residential sectors were decoupled from their standard grids. Engineering teams, working in sweat-soaked hazard suits, rewired them into devastating, localized discharge capacitors, burying them behind decorative wall panels, ready to fry heavy alien armor in a single, blinding arc of electricity. The massive carbon dioxide reserves used to feed the vital hydroponic greenhouses of the station were rerouted. Miles of high-pressure piping were welded into the narrowest transit corridors, creating invisible, lethal pressure traps that could suffocate a boarding party in seconds. The magnetic braking coils of the internal tram network were ripped from their housings and repurposed to magnetically lock and permanently seal strategic choke points. Even the heavy, automated fire doors, originally designed to drop and contain localized blazes, were reprogrammed by frantic slicing teams. They altered the codes so the massive slabs of steel would slam shut in unpredictable, chaotic sequences, turning long, familiar hallways into deadly, segmented kill zones. Beneath the polished veneer of the modern station lay the ancient, scarred bones of the original pioneer mining colony. Silas ordered the heavy, dust-covered seals blown on shafts that had not seen light in 50 years. Decades of rust and silence gave way to the harsh glare of tactical flashlights and the scream of plasma cutters as his engineering teams mapped the chaotic, winding veins of the upper mantle of the moon. They linked these abandoned, treacherous tunnels directly into the active maintenance shafts and emergency escape routes of the modern station above. They were creating a multi-layered, three-dimensional battlefield that defied conventional mapping. The concept of a front line evaporated entirely. There was no front, no rear, no flanks. There was only the maze, and the humans were the minotaurs. Meanwhile, across the silent expanse of the void, diplomat Nia Calder transmitted the formal, legally required human response from a heavily shielded communications buoy. It was a massive data packet, heavily encrypted to simulate utmost importance and secrecy. It contained the exact structural schematics of Helios Gate, fulfilling the rigid demand of the enemy for procedural transparency before the onset of hostilities. The data was completely authentic. It was also exactly 2 orbital cycles out of date. The Lhoryn intelligence officers, standing on the pristine, glowing decks of their golden flagship, received the transmission and rejoiced. Their rigid doctrine dictated that the enemy had finally capitulated to the civilized procedures of honorable combat. They fed the schematics into their vast holographic tactical displays, meticulously studying the geometry of the station, plotting their majestic boarding actions. They were entirely unaware that they were dedicating precious hours to memorizing the layout of a labyrinth that Silas Kade had already gutted, rewired, and turned completely inside out. They were preparing to invade a ghost ship. Back on the station, the rhythmic thrum of industrial sabotage replaced the panic of the evacuation. Silas moved through the corridors, personally overseeing the deceptions. He converted the advanced virtual reality simulation chambers of the primary education sector into elaborate, heat-generating phantom command centers. He ordered the installation of oscillating thermal emitters and spoofed communication relays. To the Lhoryn sensors, scanning from high orbit, the empty elementary schools would look exactly like the bustling, heavily shielded military headquarters they expected to find, radiating heat and encrypted chatter. The medical wing underwent a similarly brutal pragmatism. The state-of-the-art bioprinters, typically used to weave synthetic tissue, veins, and bone replacements for trauma victims, were violently reprogrammed. Instead of organic material, the sterilized hoppers were loaded with ballistic polymers, carbon fiber, and high-tensile alloys. They began churning out crude but brutally effective combat components, weapon modifications, and emergency structural joints by the thousands. The gentle hum of healing machinery became the harsh grind of an impromptu munitions factory. With the station primed, the traps set, and the civilian population safely buried beneath miles of solid ice, Silas addressed the remaining skeleton crew of defenders. They were not soldiers in crisp uniforms. They were asteroid miners with calloused hands, dock workers carrying heavy lifting rigs, hazard disposal teams in bulky suits, and maintenance riggers clutching repurposed welding torches and jury-rigged kinetic rifles. They stood in the cavernous, dimly lit central hub, their faces illuminated by the flickering emergency lights. Silas did not stand on a podium. He walked among them. He did not offer them a soaring speech about the glory of Earth or the honor of the fleet. He did not ask them to hold the line or fight to the bitter, bloody end. His final, most critical directive was simple, cold, and entirely antithetical to Lhoryn military doctrine. He looked at the weary, grease-stained faces of his improvised army, his voice echoing flatly off the metallic bulkheads. "You do not stand your ground," Silas instructed, his eyes locking with the men and women who were about to face the most advanced infantry in the galaxy. "When they breach, and they will breach, you break their momentum and you vanish. Do not engage in a fair fight. Do not let them see your numbers. I expect every single squad, no matter how small, to operate with one absolute, unbreakable rule. You must always maintain 3 distinct escape routes at all times, and you must leave behind one plausible lie for the enemy to believe. A false heat signature, a rigged radio, a locked door leading to a vacuum. Let them bleed fighting the ghosts of this station while we tear them apart from the shadows." The appointed hour of engagement arrived with the absolute precision of celestial mechanics. Archmarshal Sarek Val stood upon the elevated command dais of his flagship, a vessel of breathtaking, terrifying beauty. Around him, the grand armada of the Ascendancy glided into the designated illumination zone of the Helios Gate, exactly as the ancient rituals of war dictated. 300 capital ships moved as a single, flawless organism. Their hulls, carved from resonant crystalline alloys, caught the raw starlight, reflecting a blinding, unified glory across the void. Their formations were tight, symmetrical, and deeply symbolic, a phalanx designed to project absolute civilized dominance. The gunnery choirs chanted their targeting litanies, weapon capacitors humming at maximum yield, fully prepared to meet the human defenders in a magnificent exchange of fire and honor. They waited. The tactical holographic displays on the bridge projected the vast expanse of the designated battlesphere. It was empty. The grand human fleet, the desperate final stand of a cornered species, was entirely absent. There were no dreadnoughts waiting with railguns charged, no fighter swarms forming defensive screens, not even a solitary patrol cutter offering a futile gesture of defiance. Sarek Val narrowed his eyes, the heavy gold ornaments of his uniform clinking softly as he leaned over the sensor console. The deep void was not entirely vacant, but what the scanners painted made no tactical sense. Drifting aimlessly through the designated kill zone were swarms of autonomous, battered mining tugs. Trailing behind them were massive, unfurled sheets of commercial reflective sails, the kind used to propel cheap cargo barges across inter-system trade winds. Scattered haphazardly among these were dense, rectangular blocks of processed silicate and raw, unrefined ice. In the deeper shadows cast by the moon, faint, flickering thermal blooms pulsed sporadically. To a casual glance, or a rudimentary automated scanner, they registered as the distant, idling engines of stealth frigates. The Archmarshal felt a surge of cold contempt. He assumed the humans had simply broken entirely. He believed they had fled, leaving behind their garbage to clog the approach, too cowardly to even offer the dignity of a formal surrender. He ordered his fleet to advance, instructing the helmsman to simply sweep the debris aside and claim the gate. That was his first critical mistake. The debris was not static. It was deeply, maliciously kinetic. As the Grand Armada accelerated, the vast reflective sails caught the concentrated glare of the alien drive plumes. The sails were angled specifically to bounce that intense thermal energy directly back into the sensitive navigation sensors of the advancing warships. Simultaneously, the automated mining tugs, running on randomized, chaotic flight paths programmed by an engineer who understood fluid dynamics better than military strategy, began darting erratically through the alien formation. The Ascendancy fleet operated on a strict doctrine of automated collision avoidance. It was a matter of pride. Their ships never touched, preserving the pristine sanctity of their hulls. When the blind sensors registered sudden, intense heat spikes, and the tugs painted themselves as incoming, high-mass projectiles, the alien navigation computers automatically initiated evasive maneuvers. A single ship correcting its course was negligible. But when 300 tightly packed vessels simultaneously attempted to dodge phantom heat signatures and erratic industrial drones, the result was a cascading mechanical panic. The perfect, ceremonial phalanx began to bow and warp. Ships were forced to break their sacred alignments, thrusting laterally to avoid the human junk, only to find themselves directly in the path of their sister ships. To avoid crashing into one another, they pushed further outward, drifting inexorably away from the safe, illuminated center of the zone, and toward the treacherous, jagged perimeter of the ice debris field orbiting the jump gate. Sarek Val barked orders to hold formation, demanding his captains override their automated safeties. But the human trap was not finished. While the fleet struggled against the physical illusions, the true dagger struck invisibly through the digital ether. The Ascendancy relied heavily on the established network of deep space navigational beacons. The sacred signals, they called them, to synchronize their massive, complex fleet maneuvers. They trusted these beacons implicitly, viewing the infrastructure of the cosmos as neutral, unassailable ground. They did not know that several months prior, during a routine commercial inspection, a human architect had quietly uploaded a minor maritime safety patch into the central beacon registry. As the alien fleet strained to realign, that sleeping algorithm woke up. It did not shut the beacons down. That would have been immediately noticed and corrected as an act of sabotage. Instead, the patch introduced a micro-synchronization error. It delayed the timestamp telemetry of every beacon by exactly one fraction of a millisecond. In the slow, lumbering world of civilian cargo hauling, a fraction of a millisecond was meaningless. In a tightly packed military formation, traveling at significant fractions of light speed, attempting to execute synchronized, high-velocity course corrections, it was catastrophic. The targeting and navigation computers of the alien warships suddenly fundamentally disagreed on exactly where they were in space and time. A cruiser believed the dreadnought to its port side was 50 meters further ahead than it actually was. Retro rockets fired violently to compensate for distances that did not exist. Heavy magnetic dampeners locked up abruptly. The absolute silence of space was entirely irrelevant to the horrifying, grinding groan of crystalline armor sliding against crystalline armor, echoing inside the pressurized hulls. Perfect, unbroken ships scraped against one another, shearing off vital sensor vanes and point defense turrets. Sparks the size of small buildings showered into the dark as immense thrusters burned massive amounts of precious reaction mass just to stop themselves from tearing each other apart. The chaos cascaded backward into their logistical tail. The heavy, slow-moving supply tenders, programmed to arrive at precise coordinates at precise moments to refuel the combat vessels, dropped out of their staging jumps directly into a shifting, unpredictable mess of friendly warships. Docking clamps missed their receivers entirely, rupturing fuel lines and venting highly volatile plasma into the void. The meticulously planned supply rhythms, the literal lifeblood of a sustained siege, were entirely broken before the vanguard even fired a weapon. Archmarshal Sarek Val stood paralyzed on his bridge. The grand holographic display, which was supposed to show a triumphant, orderly march to an easy victory, was instead a chaotic swarm of red hazard runes and proximity warnings. His glorious fleet was bleeding fuel, taking severe structural damage, and losing its operational cohesion, all while desperately fighting against empty space. He looked for the enemy. He searched the tactical feeds for a massive human warship to target, a sprawling command center to incinerate, a cunning general to outsmart in a battle of wits. There was absolutely nothing. The realization hit the alien commander like a physical blow to the chest. He was not fighting an opposing admiral. He was fighting the maritime order itself. He was at war with docking sequences, supply priority protocols, and algorithmic conflicts. The human architect had weaponized time, empty space, and the mundane infrastructure of interstellar trade. 60 entire minutes passed since they had majestically entered the battle zone. The grand chronometer ticked forward relentlessly, mocking their immobility. Sarek Val looked out at his magnificent, crippled armada. They had completely lost their tactical positioning. They were hopelessly out of alignment, burning rapidly through their energy reserves, and heavily entangled in their own panicked automated corrections. The absolute, freezing shock of the moment settled deep into the bones of the Archmarshal. In one single hour of brutal, exhausting combat, the Great Ascendancy had definitively lost the battle for the outer perimeter, and they had not managed to fire a single kinetic round at a human warship, simply because no one had bothered to show up for them to shoot. Infuriated by the phantom engagement that had left his magnificent armada bruised and humiliated, Archmarshal Sarek Val changed his grand strategy. If the humans refused the honor of a direct orbital clash, he would strangle them with the slow, suffocating grip of a formal siege. Standing on his pristine command deck, he invoked the ancient edict of the merciful victor. He broadcast a system-wide declaration, establishing a total military blockade around Helios Gate, but offering a legally binding, heavily monitored safe corridor for the evacuation of all non-combatants. The window would remain open for exactly 48 hours. It was a calculated display of civilized warfare, designed to force the humans into a corner, making them huddle in the dark while they waited for the inevitable boarding action. The response from the station arrived in less than 2 minutes. Silas Kade accepted the terms unconditionally. To Sarek Val and his tactical officers, this rapid capitulation confirmed their deepest biases. The humans were terrified. Their initial trickery had been a desperate spasm, and now, faced with the overwhelming, inescapable reality of the Ascendancy blockade, their morale had completely shattered. They were eager to empty their fortress, leaving behind a skeleton crew waiting to be slaughtered or captured. The evacuation that followed was not a trick. It was a raw, bleeding wound of human displacement. Endless lines of civilians shuffled through the cold, metallic embarkation tubes toward the massive, scarred bulk transport ships. There was no heroic stoicism, only the grim, terrifying reality of abandoning home. Parents tightly gripped the hands of weeping children, their faces pale under the harsh fluorescent lights of the docking bays. Medics rushed wheeled stretchers, carrying the elderly and the critically ill. the rhythmic mechanical sighs of portable ventilators, cutting through the low murmur of thousands of frightened voices. The Lhoryn patrol cruisers, hovering just outside the docking perimeter, ran invasive, deep penetrating molecular scans on every departing vessel. They saw exactly what they expected to see. They registered the dense biological mass of panicked refugees. They scanned crates of synthetic antibiotics, sterile bandages, oxygen scrubbers, and heavy disaster relief modules stamped with international medical insignias. The alien sensors found absolutely zero kinetic weapons, no fissile materials, and no hidden warships. Dismissive in their arrogant pity, the alien commanders allowed the convoys to pass through the golden blockade lines, watching the pathetic human fleet burn hard for the outer colonies. But Silas Kade understood a fundamental truth about his enemy. They looked only for what their military doctrine told them was dangerous. Buried deep within the cargo holds of those fleeing civilian ships, packed tightly between legitimate crates of blood plasma and emergency rations, were specialized disaster recovery pods. They were perfectly legal civilian hardware, typically deployed to establish temporary communications after a catastrophic planetary earthquake. But Silas had spent the last week modifying their core programming. Once the refugee ships safely cleared the blockade zone and jumped into deep space, they silently ejected these pods into the dark void. Back on Helios Gate, the 48 hours expired. The safe corridor snapped shut. The siege officially began. From orbit, the Lhoryn sensor sweeps painted a picture of a station bracing for a futile final stand. The grand central promenade of the habitat ring was blazing with brilliant neon light. The commercial plazas emitted massive heat signatures, exactly mimicking the thermal bloom of heavy plasma batteries spooling up for defense. The administrative spires at the apex of the station were a chaotic storm of encrypted radio traffic and command signals, suggesting that the human brass was frantically coordinating a desperate defense from their polished offices. It was a brilliant, intricate lie. The surface of Helios Gate was completely abandoned. The brightly lit plazas were empty, their heat generated by industrial smelting coils, stripped from the factories and draped with thermal blankets. The frantic radio chatter was a pre-recorded loop of old mining logistics, heavily encrypted to make the aliens waste their supercomputers trying to crack it. The true command center of the human resistance had descended into a place no honorable military commander would ever consider a strategic asset. Silas had moved his entire defensive operation miles beneath the ice crust of Nereth, into the foul, roaring bowels of the station. They established their headquarters inside the primary waste filtration sector and the subterranean geothermal pumping halls. The air down there was thick with the smell of ozone, rust, and processed sewage. The noise was deafening. A constant, bone-rattling vibration from the massive, house-sized turbines churning millions of gallons of reclaimed water. There were no sleek holographic tables or comfortable leather chairs. Silas stood over a rusted, repurposed maintenance console, studying tactical feeds projected onto a damp, concrete blast wall. He was surrounded by a grim, silent crew of engineers, sanitation workers, and rugged ice miners. This was the true heart of the war. It was dirty, suffocating, and utterly invisible to the golden warships floating above. Up on the station surface, Silas had prepared a specific welcome for the inevitable boarding parties. The primary airlocks and landing pads had been modified with exquisite, deceptive care. His teams had welded massive, intimidating steel barricades across the main entryways. They had positioned heavy, automated blast doors in ways that looked like a desperate, amateurish attempt to fortify the main corridors. To the elite Lhoryn shock troops preparing their dropships, these defenses looked like a classic, textbook bottleneck. They saw the heavy barricades and immediately spotted the subtle structural flaws Silas had deliberately left behind: a weakened maintenance hatch here, an exposed ventilation shaft there. The aliens would believe they had outsmarted the crude human engineers, choosing to bypass the heavy barricades to infiltrate through these apparent vulnerabilities. They would not realize that Silas had designed those barricades specifically to fail, funneling the alien invaders away from the sprawling, open concourses and directly into a claustrophobic, reinforced maze of industrial meat grinders. He was guiding them exactly where he wanted them, into the lightless, airless maintenance arteries, where their superior numbers and heavy armor would become a fatal liability. For 3 tense, agonizing days, the Archmarshal held his fleet in a perfect, suffocating blockade. He waited for the humans to break radio silence, to beg for terms, or to launch a suicidal sortie. He watched the fake heat signatures burn on the station surface, confident that he held the throat of his enemy firmly in his armored glove. Then, exactly 72 hours after the final refugee ship had vanished into the black, the tactical officers on the Lhoryn flagship noticed an anomaly. It did not come from the station in front of them. It came from the vast, empty void of space directly behind their fleet. The disaster recovery pods, discarded by the civilian convoy days earlier, had drifted into calculated positions millions of miles away. Stripped of their peaceful programming, they simultaneously unfolded, delicate, spiderweb arrays of passive sensors deployed, linking together across the absolute zero of the vacuum. Microprinters within the pods silently churned out microscopic relay nodes, casting them into the stellar wind to form a massive, invisible net of surveillance. Archmarshal Sarek Val stared at his rearguard tactical monitors in complete, horrified silence. The vast, empty space at his back was suddenly illuminated by hundreds of tiny, interconnected data points. The medical supplies had bloomed. The humans had not just evacuated their people. They had seeded the darkness, Sarek realized, with a sickening drop in his stomach, that the humans were not trapped inside the station at all. They had turned the entire orbital sphere into a panopticon, and his magnificent, besieging fleet was now sitting completely exposed, illuminated, and tracked from every conceivable angle. Caught perfectly in the center of an ambush, they had politely allowed the enemy to build. The drop pods struck the outer hull of the habitat ring like a coordinated meteor shower. Within the first few minutes, the elite vanguard of the Ascendancy tore through the primary airlocks with terrifying, surgical precision. They did not creep through the corridors. They surged like a tidal wave of golden armor and humming energy rifles. They flooded the Grand Central Avenue, their heavy boots echoing against the polished decking of the deserted commercial fronts. They met absolute zero resistance. By the end of the first hour, the alien shock troops had stormed the administrative spire, blowing the heavy doors off the governor's suite. They immediately tapped into the station communication grid. On every view screen across the solar system, the golden, radiant crest of the Lhoryn replaced the human insignia. To the billions of allied citizens watching from the inner planets, and even to the terrified refugees huddled in the dark void, it looked exactly like a total, humiliating defeat. The great bastion had fallen in mere minutes. The audience was led to believe that the desperate gamble of the human architect had crumbled before it even began. The illusion of total victory lasted exactly 10 minutes. The alien infantry were still standing in formation, securing the brightly lit promenades, when the artificial gravity grid suddenly stuttered. It dropped to a fraction of normal, sending heavily armored shock troops floating clumsily off the deck, their perfectly drilled formations instantly dissolving into a flailing mess. 2 seconds later, the gravity slammed back down at double the standard planetary weight. Alien bones fractured under the sudden, crushing shift. Simultaneously, the smart flooring of the main avenues betrayed them. The polished walking tiles rapidly retracted, revealing jagged maintenance grating and deep, exposed subfloor cabling pits. The pristine digital maps the invaders had painstakingly memorized vanished from their helmet visors. They were instantly overwritten by flashing crimson hazard warnings, endless streams of civilian emergency protocols screaming about catastrophic containment failures. Then, the doors went mad. Hundreds of heavy civilian bulkheads, commercial storefront grills, and residential airlocks began slamming shut and sliding open in violent, entirely unpredictable rhythms. Silas did not deploy infantry to establish a traditional front line. He deployed the station itself. As Lhoryn squads attempted to navigate the shifting, crushing labyrinth, the overhead fire suppression systems activated. They did not drop water. They dumped thousands of gallons of rapidly expanding, quick-hardening industrial retardant foam. The chemical sludge cascaded down the corridors, suffocating entire platoons in a rigid, synthetic amber that locked their power armor in place. In the lower habitation rings, the atmospheric life support was violently hijacked. Wide corridors were abruptly flooded with cryogenic cooling mist, dropping ambient temperatures to lethal lows and freezing the intricate joints of the alien combat suits dead in their tracks. In the luxury botanical sectors, pressurized wastewater pipes burst with calculated, malicious precision. The invaders, trained for pristine energy duels, were hammered by torrential blasts of highly toxic raw sewage that blinded their optical sensors and shorted their kinetic shields. Complete blackouts rolled through the sectors, leaving the aliens entirely blind. In the pitch black, harmless janitorial drones buzzed through the air, their digital transponders spoofed by human slicing teams to register on Lhoryn scanners as heavy assault mechs. The terrified Ascendancy troops poured endless streams of heavy plasma fire into empty walls, destroying their own captured territory while fighting phantoms. When the humans did choose to fight, it was not an army. They struck in isolated, desperate groups of 2 to 4 individuals. A ventilation panel in the ceiling would slide back, and a dock worker with a rigged kinetic nail gun would drop a lethal armor-piercing charge directly into the vulnerable neck joint of an alien commander before vanishing backward down a laundry chute. Scavenger teams burst from sub-zero meat lockers, fired 3 precise shots from modified mining lasers, and retreated back into the freezing fog before the Ascendancy troops could even unholster their heavy cannons. The Lhoryn soldiers were heavily conditioned for magnificent, sweeping volleys of coordinated, honorable fire. Here, in the claustrophobic nightmare of the civilian decks, they were being bled out by ghosts who refused to stand still long enough to be targeted. Deep in the administrative spire, the Vanguard commander relayed a triumphant, breathless message up to the orbiting fleet. His squad had breached a heavily shielded core room. Inside, they found banks of massive tactical screens displaying fleet movements, power grids, and troop deployments. Sarek Val, watching the live feed from the safety of his flagship, felt a surge of arrogant satisfaction. He believed he had finally caught the brain of the resistance. He believed the war was over. It was a complete fabrication. The elite strike force had not captured the central command. They had stormed a high school disaster simulation lab. The sophisticated educational computers were actively feeding the Lhoryn commander completely fabricated coordinates, directing his heavily armed reinforcement shuttles straight into dead-end docking bays rigged with shaped mining explosives. Driven by mounting frustration, heavy casualties, and a complete breakdown of their communication networks, the Lhoryn forces were pushed deeper into the bowels of the station. They were forced to abandon the wide, brightly lit concourses that perfectly suited their combat doctrine. The hostile environment dragged them down into the narrow, dripping, metallic-smelling underbelly of the infrastructure. The beautiful, ceremonial war of the Ascendancy was reduced to a miserable, terrifying slog through waist-deep coolant fluid. They were forced to crawl on their bellies through narrow ventilation shafts lined with rusted, jagged metal. The air grew thick with the stench of ozone, rotting organic matter, and the terrifying, deafening roar of massive industrial machinery. Their pristine golden armor was caked in grime and blood. The ultimate insult, the brilliant tactical twist that the alien strategists could never have anticipated, was the actual location of the human command center. Silas was not hiding in a pristine bunker of reinforced military plasteel. He was sitting on a cracked plastic crate in the absolute epicenter of the primary water and waste recycling plant. It was an environment so spectacularly filthy, so completely devoid of any perceived tactical or honorable value, that Lhoryn military doctrine literally lacked the algorithms to even scan for it. Surrounded by roaring filtration turbines, overflowing vats of chemical sludge, and the overwhelming stench of human refuse, Silas watched his bleeding, broken station tear the invaders apart piece by piece. He was orchestrating the systematic slaughter of the most advanced military force in the galaxy from the literal sewer, proving that when survival is on the line, humanity cares absolutely nothing for glory. The structural support beam of Sector 7 finally gave way under the immense stress of the sustained assault, bringing down a massive section of the primary ceiling. Amidst the settling dust, the electrical fires, and the terrifying groan of fatigued steel, a heavily armored alien extraction team dragged a single human from the wreckage. It was Lieutenant Bram Foss. He was incredibly young, his face smeared with thick grease and his own blood, his left arm hanging at an unnatural, sickening angle. To the towering, pristine warriors of the Ascendancy, the boy looked exactly like what their ancient military doctrine promised, a broken, terrified creature at the absolute limit of his physical and psychological endurance. The weakest link in a crumbling chain, thrown roughly onto the cold deck before a local unit commander. Bram coughed, producing a wet, rattling sound from deep within his chest. He did not spit defiance at the golden armor towering over him. He did not attempt a futile, glorious last stand. Instead, his voice shaking violently, he offered them a regional surrender code. He pleaded with the glowing visors of his captors, his breath hitching in pain. He claimed that if they entered the sequence into the localized command node on the wall, an entire subsector would power down its localized defensive grids and open its primary bulkheads, allowing the humans trapped inside to be spared from the grinding, merciless slaughter. The alien unit commander immediately relayed the string of spoken digits up to the flagship in high orbit. In his immaculate command sanctum, Archmarshal Sarek Val fed the sequence into the primary tactical computers. The glowing, crystalline intelligence of the Ascendancy chewed on the human code for exactly 3 seconds before confirming its absolute authenticity. It was a high-level system override. It carried the digital signature of the station administrator and possessed the correct clearance architecture. Sarek felt a profound wave of relief wash over him, his tense shoulders finally dropping a fraction of an inch. The brutal, dishonorable slog through the industrial mud of the station was finally yielding tangible results. The human spirit, entirely devoid of the rigid discipline of a true warrior race, had finally reached its breaking point. He authorized his ground commander to input the code. Down in the smoky corridor, the alien officer confidently punched the sequence into the wall terminal. They expected the flickering emergency lighting to shift to a compliant, peaceful white. They expected the heavy blast doors ahead to slide smoothly into their recesses, revealing kneeling, defeated militia members, offering their weapons in submission. What they got instead was a sound that defied description, a deep, resonant, agonizing metallic scream that vibrated up through the soles of their heavy boots and rattled their teeth inside their helmets. The sequence Bram Foss had surrendered was not a military capitulation protocol. It was a catastrophic emergency depressurization detachment sequence, an extreme architectural failsafe originally designed for the worst-case scenario of an uncontrollable internal fire or a massive, localized asteroid strike. Deep within the superstructure of the station, massive explosive bolts, each the size of a standard transport shuttle, simultaneously detonated. An entire residential arm of the station, a massive, cylindrical structure weighing hundreds of thousands of tons violently unlatched from the central hub. Stripped of its stabilizing gravity tethers and primary structural locks, the enormous, completely empty civilian sector swung wildly off its central axis. Driven by the explosive force of its own rapid decompression, the colossal cylinder drifted laterally, scraping violently across the primary advance corridor that the Lhoryn vanguard was using to funnel their heavy reinforcements into the habitat. The effect was instantaneous and tactically devastating. The sweeping, unguided mass of the detached sector physically sheared through the main staging area, cutting the alien assault force entirely in two. The heavily armed vanguard, pushing deep into human territory, was suddenly completely isolated from their rear supply lines, their medical support, and their heavy artillery teams. High above the station, the alien fleet targeting computers screamed in frustration, painting the drifting cylinder with bright red targeting lasers. The colossal piece of debris was perfectly positioned, completely blocking the orbital firing solutions for the stranded vanguard below. But because the structure was officially registered in the galactic database as a protected civilian housing habitat, the rigid, unyielding laws of Lhoryn warfare absolutely forbade the orbital cruisers from firing their main batteries upon it. They knew the sector was entirely empty, but their sacred doctrine paralyzed their trigger fingers. The humans now possessed the most precious commodity in any siege uninterrupted time. In the chaotic 20 minutes that the Lhoryn command structure spent paralyzed by their own rules and the sheer physical obstruction blocking their path, human rescue teams flooded the danger zones. They hauled their wounded comrades and the last remaining trapped citizens out through narrow service hatches and hidden maintenance shafts, pulling them back from the edge of the abyss and disappearing before the alien reinforcements could find a way around the massive blockage. Silas Kade did not let the disruption end with a mere retreat. While the Ascendancy vanguard was frantically trying to blow through the maintenance corridors to re-establish a link with their severed rear guard, Silas ordered his assault teams into the wastewater magnetic levitation tubes. Riding the high-speed, utterly silent transit lines, normally reserved for moving raw, pressurized sewage, the human fighters bypassed the blocked corridors entirely. They emerged like wraiths from the floor grills and heavy pumping sumps directly behind the isolated alien vanguard. The Lhoryn troops, their optical sensors still pointed anxiously forward at the massive piece of station blocking their path, were suddenly caught in a brutal, point-blank crossfire from the rear. Aboard the flagship, Archmarshal Sarek Val stared at the shifting tactical map in cold, seething fury. The agonizing truth settled over him like a heavy shroud. The captured human boy had not lied to them. The code had indeed ceased resistance in that sector, and it had indeed saved the trapped people. Bram Foss had simply provided a deadly truth that Lhoryn military doctrine was entirely too inflexible to comprehend. The aliens believed the universe operated on binary states. You either fought with honor, or you surrendered with grace. They lacked the imagination to understand a strategy that literally reshaped the physical geography of the battlefield, just to change the rules of the engagement. Deep in the subterranean geothermal pumping halls, surrounded by the deafening roar of the massive water turbines, Silas Kade received the final casualty report of the hour. The extraction teams had secured the civilians, and the flanking maneuver had crippled the alien vanguard. But they had not been able to reach the collapse site in time. Lieutenant Bram Foss had succumbed to his massive internal injuries on the cold deck plates, dying surrounded by confused alien soldiers just as the massive station arm tore itself free. Silas did not celebrate the brilliant tactical victory. He stared at his grease-stained hands for a long time, the rhythmic thrum of the recycling plant acting as a heavy, mechanical heartbeat around him. He turned away from the holographic tactical map, his face drawn and pale. He routed a heavily encrypted, tight-beam communication laser toward the inner system, pointing it directly toward the distant blue sphere of Earth. He bypassed all military command frequencies and dialed a simple, civilian planetary node. Defeating a vastly superior foe required a mind capable of monstrous, cold arithmetic. But Silas never allowed himself to forget that the numbers on his screen were people. He stood alone in the dim, foul-smelling room, waiting for the interstellar connection to establish. He closed his eyes, bracing himself to tell a mother exactly how brilliantly and how terribly her son had just died in order to buy humanity another day of survival. The immaculate command sanctum of the Ascendancy flagship had lost its golden luster. Archmarshal Sarek Val stood alone before the expansive holographic table. The ambient lighting dimmed to a mournful violet. For the first time in his long, decorated career, he was suffering from a profound inability to sleep. The rigid, elegant logic of Lhoryn warfare, refined over 10,000 years of glorious conquest, had completely shattered against the rusted bulkheads of Helios Gate. He could not predict Silas Kade. Every algorithmic projection, every behavioral model designed to anticipate an enemy commander, had returned a devastating error code. Desperate for a framework, Sarek bypassed his tactical advisors and ordered the Fleet Intelligence Corpus to scrape the intercepted civilian databases of humanity. If the human architect refused to fight like a rational general, then Sarek needed to find a historical anomaly to classify him. He commanded the machines to search for a feral model, a primitive warlord, a forgotten barbarian king whose chaotic stratagems might explain the nightmare unfolding in the depths of the Ice Moon Station. Hours bled into the night rotation as the data packets compiled. But when the crystalline screens illuminated with the translated texts, Sarek did not find epic poems of glorious charges or the refined treatises of honorable duels. He found something infinitely more terrifying. He found a siege diary written by a starving citizen trapped in a frozen city for 900 days. He found heavily redacted procedural manuals detailing exactly how to extinguish subterranean wildfires that had burned for half a century. He read harrowing, clinically detached protocols written for sailors trapped inside crushed metal tubes at the bottom of crushing oceans. He reviewed architectural blueprints specifically designed to endure the atmospheric shockwaves of nuclear detonations, and mundane, bureaucratic handbooks instructing ordinary civilians on how to plunge their entire cities into absolute darkness to evade nocturnal bombing raids. He watched grainy, recovered footage of orbital astronauts calmly running drills to patch explosive decompression leaks, using nothing but chemical adhesives and sheer, terrifying willpower. A cold, creeping dread settled into the marrow of the Archmarshal. The humans were not a warrior race in the way the Ascendancy understood the term. They did not revere the battlefield as a sacred altar of honor. To humanity, war was simply another flavor of the apocalypse. Sarek realized the core, terrifying truth. The most dangerous thing about this species was not that they enjoyed violence. It was that they practiced for the collapse of their own world as a matter of civilized routine. They raised their children in the shadow of potential extinction. They trained their civil engineers to stabilize melting atomic cores. They taught their civic firefighters how to carve paths through thousands of tons of collapsed concrete. They instructed their dock workers on how to maintain fragile supply chains while the sky rained fire. When a formal, declared war arrived, all of those deeply ingrained, catastrophic survival skills instantly metamorphosed into a brutal, asymmetric arsenal. Silas Kade was not a military mastermind attempting to emulate a general. He was exactly what his official title claimed. He was an architect of disaster. To Silas, the majestic invasion fleet of the Lhoryn Ascendancy was no different than a micrometeoroid shower, a ruptured thermal vent, or a localized gravity shear. It was merely a catastrophic variable that needed to be contained, redirected, and ultimately exhausted. He was weaponizing the sheer, stubborn endurance of a society built to survive the end of the world. This psychological revelation rippled down from the flagship and infected the bleeding vanguard trapped inside the station. The psychology of the Lhoryn soldier began to break. For generations, they had been conditioned to charge toward the sound of heavy artillery, seeking glory in the deafening roar of a fair fight. But now, deep within the dripping, lightless arteries of Helios Gate, the alien infantry had learned a new, paralyzing phobia. They began to fear the silence more than the gunfire. When the heavy kinetic rifles of the human resistance echoed through the halls, the Lhoryn could at least return fire. They could understand a bullet, But when the cavernous industrial sectors fell completely, suffocatingly quiet, panic would instantly seize the alien squads. To the human defenders, silence was not a retreat. Silence meant a massive, unseen system was actively being reconfigured to kill the invaders in exactly 3 minutes. A quiet corridor meant the air recyclers were quietly pumping odorless neurotoxins into the ventilation shafts. A still pool of water meant a high-voltage conduit was being lowered into the reservoir 1 floor above. The Ascendancy troops stopped advancing. They huddled in the damp shadows, aiming their glowing rifles at empty doorways, jumping at the sound of settling metal, thoroughly terrorized by the infrastructure itself. Sarek Val turned away from the historical archives and looked back at the grand orbital map hovering above his console. He began to piece the jagged fragments together. He looked at the massive, disconnected civilian sector drifting uselessly in the void. He looked at the labyrinth of dead zones inside the station where his troops were bleeding out for inches of worthless territory. He looked at the agonizingly slow pace of the engagement. Silas was not trying to win a battle of attrition. He was not trying to drive the Grand Armada away. If he had wanted to inflict maximum casualties, he would have vented the primary atmosphere hours ago, killing his own people alongside the invaders. Instead, he was dragging the fight out, second by painful second. He was trading space for time. But time for what? Sarek commanded the holographic display to zoom out, expanding the tactical view past the station, past the ice moon of Nereth, and out toward the blazing furnace of the local star. He cross-referenced the orbital trajectories, the gravitational shear charts, and the deep space telemetry that the human navigation patches had previously corrupted. The pieces snapped together with the finality of a closing vault door. Sarek saw the celestial mechanics aligning perfectly on the screen. He saw the orbital path of the massive ice moon, the position of his own anchored fleet, and the rapidly building instability of the star at the center of the system. Silas had never been fighting to hold the station. The station was just the bait. The human architect had orchestrated a massive, system-wide delay, forcing the Ascendancy to anchor their heaviest, most valuable warships in a highly specific, totally unshielded gravity, well to maintain their prideful blockade. The profound, sickening twist of realization hit the Archmarshal like a physical blow to the chest. He finally understood the human methodology of war, but the universe was laughing at him. His enlightenment had arrived entirely too late. He had spent the last 4 days studying the trap from the inside, stubbornly refusing to yield his position, proudly maintaining a siege that the enemy had actively encouraged. Sarek Val realized that he had marched his magnificent, invincible armada so deeply into the intricate, temporal snare set by Silas Kade that the window for a safe, coordinated hyperspace retreat had completely, irreversibly closed. They were stuck, and the heavens were about to open fire. The celestial clockwork of the system was winding toward a spectacular, violent crescendo. Deep space telemetry arrays, battered but still functional, predicted a catastrophic coronal mass ejection from the central star in exactly 6 days. A wave of raw stellar fury was coming. But before the fire, the cosmos offered a fleeting shroud of absolute black. A planetary alignment was sliding the frozen moon of Nereth directly into the massive, imposing shadow of its parent gas giant. It was a total eclipse, a complete cessation of starlight that would blanket the orbital battlefield for exactly 19 minutes. According to the ancient, immutable dogma of the Lhoryn Ascendancy, heavy warfare was strictly prohibited during the phase of the sacred shadow. It was a time for reflection, for honoring the fallen, and for the realignment of martial spirits. Archmarshal Sarek Val, observing the encroaching darkness from his command throne, sneered at the old texts. He believed that if the humans possessed even a fraction of civilized decency, they would use the pause to cower, mourn, and prepare for their inevitable end. But Sarek had discarded his own dogma. The agonizing, humiliating grind of the station siege had stripped away his reverence for the ancient rules. He needed a decisive, crushing victory, and he was willing to commit heresy to achieve it. Under the cover of the creeping penumbra, Sarek ordered the crown jewel of the armada, the super dreadnought known as the Radiant Mercy, to break its blockade formation. The colossal vessel, a floating cathedral of crystalline armor and devastating weaponry, glided silently into the deepest pocket of the Umbra. It positioned its massive ventral hull directly over the polar ice caps of Nereth, aiming straight down at the subterranean thermal signatures of the human civilian bunkers. Sarek was charging the solar lance, a concentrated thermal projection weapon designed to boil oceans. He intended to use the 19 minutes of sacred darkness to bypass the safety spools, bringing the weapon to maximum yield. The very second the eclipse ended and the first ray of starlight kissed the hull, he would fire, cracking the moon to its core and vaporizing the human resistance in one single, glorious strike. Miles below the surface, swallowed by the crushing cold of the ice crust, Silas Kade had been waiting for this exact moment of alien hypocrisy. He knew Sarek would break. He knew a commander bleeding prestige would eventually reach for the biggest gun in his arsenal. Silas abandoned the relative safety of the wastewater command center. Clad in a heavy, frost-covered environmental suit, he personally led a strike team of 4 veteran tunnel runners up a crumbling, vertical ore elevator shaft that had been sealed since the first generation of pioneers. The ascent was agonizing. The cold bit through their insulated layers, and the decaying metal groaned under their weight. Their destination was not a weapons cache or a shield generator. It was a forgotten node of the original, pre-colonial magnetic rail network, a massive, archaic ring of superconducting electromagnets buried deep in the permafrost, originally used to catapult raw materials into orbit. As the total eclipse engulfed the moon, plunging the battlefield into a blindness so profound it felt physical, Silas and his team reached the terminal. The power grids were dead, severed decades ago. Working entirely by touch and the dim, red glow of chemical light sticks, they spliced heavy plasma batteries directly into the ancient conduits. They had exactly 19 minutes. High above them, drifting in the pitch-black vacuum, the battlefield debris from the opening day of the war was still floating aimlessly. The Lhoryn had ignored it, dismissing the discarded commercial mirror sails and ruined mining barges as harmless garbage. But as Silas slammed the massive manual breaker down in the frozen bunker, the ancient magnetic rail network woke up. It generated a sudden, intensely localized gravity shear. The invisible magnetic tethers lashed out into the orbital dark, grabbing the metallic skeletons of the ruined barges and hauling them into a new configuration. The enormous, highly reflective commercial sails were dragged silently across the void. Swept along in their wake was a dense, suffocating cloud of unrefined nickel ice ore dust, shaken loose from the shattered mining transports. In the absolute darkness of the eclipse, Silas was not building a wall. He was constructing a bespoke, geometric optic puzzle, and he was positioning it directly into the forward firing arc and the primary escape vector of the Radiant Mercy. On the bridge of the Super Dreadnought, the countdown to the end of the eclipse ticked down. 18 minutes and 30 seconds. The massive energy capacitors of the solar lance whined with a terrifying, bone-rattling pitch. Archmarshal Sarek Val stood at the primary viewport, watching the absolute blackness, waiting for the dawn that would signal the death of a species. 19 minutes. The edge of the gas giant shifted. A single, blinding sliver of raw, unfiltered starlight pierced the darkness, striking the crystalline hull of the Radiant Mercy. "Fire!" Sarek commanded. The ventral hull of the dreadnought split open, unleashing a column of coherent, incandescent thermal energy so bright it cast hard shadows across the entire moon. The solar lance punched down toward the ice, a spear of pure destruction moving at the speed of light. It never touched the crust of Nereth. Just kilometers above the surface, the beam struck the trap Silas had arranged in the dark. The concentrated thermal energy slammed into the overlapping layers of the commercial mirror sails. These sails were designed to ride the gentle pressure of solar winds, not withstand a dreadnought main battery. They instantly vaporized. But in the microsecond before they were destroyed, their pristine, reflective surfaces performed their fundamental physical duty. They bounced the light. The geometry was flawless. The shattered beams refracted through the dense, expanding cloud of nickel ice dust, acting like a colossal, chaotic prism. Millions of jagged metallic particles caught the scattered thermal energy and hurled it backward. Silas Kade did not board the enemy flagship. He did not fire a single bullet at it. He simply forced the most powerful weapon in the Lhoryn arsenal to fire inside a perfectly angled house of mirrors. The reflected, magnified backlash of the solar lance slammed directly into the forward sensor crown and the bridge deflector arrays of the Radiant Mercy. The impact was catastrophic. The ship's own crystalline armor, designed to absorb kinetic impacts and disperse energy across its hull, was suddenly flooded with a concentrated, localized thermal spike that it had generated itself. On the command deck, the transition from arrogant triumph to absolute terror was instantaneous. The primary viewport shattered under the thermal shock, instantly sealing behind heavy emergency blast shutters. Consoles exploded in showers of blinding white sparks. The deck heaved violently, throwing officers across the room as the massive vessel was violently pushed backward by the kinetic force of its own reflected weapon. Sirens wailed in a dozen discordant pitches. The tactical officers screamed that they were taking catastrophic damage from an unknown source. Panic ripped through the disciplined crew. They believed they had been betrayed. They thought a cloaked fleet had flanked them, or that a mutiny had taken control of their own secondary batteries. They could not comprehend that the universe was simply obeying the ruthless laws of physics. They were completely blind. Their primary sensory arrays melted into useless slag. Archmarshal Sarek Val was thrown hard against the tactical table. The breath knocked from his lungs. His immaculate golden uniform was singed, the air thick with the acrid smoke of burning electrical insulation. He pulled himself up, blood dripping from a gash on his forehead, his ears ringing from the deafening concussion. He looked at the shattered, sparking ruins of his command center. The realization crashed over him, colder than the ice moon below. He had not been bested by a superior fleet. He had not been defeated by a stronger army. He had nearly been incinerated because a human engineer had turned his own magnificent power into a suicide weapon. For the first time in his life, Sarek Val tasted the bitter, terrifying flavor of his own mortality, served to him by a man who treated light itself as a weapon of opportunity. The humiliation inflicted during the 19 minutes of absolute darkness shattered the remaining composure of Archmarshal Sarek Val. Standing amidst the sparking, ruined sensor consoles of his flagship, he wiped a streak of violet blood from his brow and discarded the last vestiges of measured strategy. He no longer wanted to conquer Helios Gate. He wanted to exterminate the mind that had dared to turn his own sacred weapon against him. Sarek ordered every surviving ship in the armada to divert their reactor power away from defensive shielding and pour it entirely into deep-crust, ground-penetrating radar. The Golden Fleet bombarded the ice moon with massive, invasive pulses of scanning energy. The sheer volume of the sweep finally burned through the layers of encrypted human interference, pinpointing a massive, anomalous thermal signature at the very bottom of the crust. It was the primary geothermal pumping station, a chaotic, boiling network of magma taps located so deep that the atmospheric pressure alone would crush a standard infantryman. Sarek recognized it immediately. It was the heart of the labyrinth. He gathered the elite vanguard of his shock troops, veterans of 100 glorious planetary drops, and launched a desperate, all-in decapitation strike. The Archmarshal believed with absolute certainty that the human resistance was a fragile web held together by a single, mad spider. If he could kick down the final door and sever the head of Silas Kade, The entire chaotic infrastructure above would instantly collapse into leaderless panic. Deep in the sweltering, deafening belly of the moon, Silas watched the descending golden dots on his rusted monitor. He did not order a retreat. He did not rig the elevator shafts with explosives. Instead, he entered a command sequence that systematically unlocked the heavy blast doors leading down to his level. He was practically holding the door open for the Archmarshal. He allowed the enemy to find him because millions of miles above their heads, the final, invisible jaws of his true trap were snapping shut. Days earlier, during the meticulously staged civilian evacuation, the fleeing human transport ships had dropped hundreds of disaster recovery pods just beyond the blockade line. Sarek had eventually discovered their passive sensor networks, but he had fundamentally misunderstood their primary function. The pods had not merely been watching the fleet, operating in absolute silence. Their automated microprinters had been systematically chewing through raw asteroid material, seeding the orbital vacuum surrounding Helios Gate with billions of microscopic, highly conductive nickel-iron particulates. It was a cloud of charged ore dust so incredibly thin, so vastly dispersed across thousands of cubic miles of space, that the sophisticated Lhoryn tactical scanners dismissed it entirely as harmless background cosmic radiation. Then, the local star unleashed its fury. The coronal mass ejection, a massive, violent belch of raw stellar radiation that human meteorological algorithms had predicted months in advance, finally slammed into the Nerith system. On its own, the solar flare would have simply caused frustrating communication blackouts for a few hours. But when that sweeping wave of heavily charged stellar particles collided with the invisible, seeded sphere of conductive ore dust surrounding the Ascendancy fleet, the vacuum literally ignited. The silent space around the Golden Armada violently transformed into a roaring, localized electromagnetic tempest. To the crystalline sensors of the Lhoryn dreadnoughts, the universe instantly went utterly, terrifyingly opaque. Their pristine tactical displays dissolved into furious static. Targeting locks shattered. Navigational vectors spun wildly out of control. The rigid, magnificent military doctrine of the Ascendancy suddenly became their executioner. In the event of catastrophic sensory blinding, Lhoryn protocol dictated that a fleet must instantly execute a synchronized, linear hyperspace retreat to preserve the formation. But attempting to open a precise dimensional tear inside a raging electromagnetic hurricane would instantly shred their delicate jump drives, tearing the massive ships into subatomic ribbons. They could not jump. They could not communicate. They could not even see the ships floating a few hundred yards away from them. Humanity survived the storm because they had never relied on pristine order. For weeks prior to the invasion, teams of human blockade runners, piloting vessels no larger than atmospheric lifeboats, had obsessively mapped the orbital space. They had memorized manual, analog blind routes, relying entirely on physical inertial navigation, dead reckoning, and basic mathematics. When the storm hit, the human pilots shattered their formations, dividing into micro-networks of 2 or 3 ships, slipping effortlessly through the blinding static like deep-sea predators navigating muddy water. The Ascendancy required a perfectly illuminated highway to march. Humanity had built a dirt road in the dark. Down in the suffocating heat of the geothermal core, the final reinforced door hissed open, its locking mechanisms severed by alien plasma torches. Archmarshal Sarek Val stepped into the cavernous chamber, his energy blade humming with lethal intent, his golden armor scarred and blackened from the descent. He brought his weapon up, fully expecting to find a hardened military bunker, a room filled with desperate generals huddled behind plasteel barricades, clutching their final weapons. Instead, Sarek stopped dead in his tracks. The blade in his hand lowered a fraction of an inch. The room was vast, echoing with the thunderous heartbeat of the magma pumps. But the people surrounding Silas Kade were not soldiers. Sarek saw exhausted nurses tending to bleeding, bandaged dockworkers on makeshift cots. He saw soot-stained mechanics clutching heavy industrial wrenches. He saw elderly refugees huddled under thermal blankets. Most jarring of all, tucked away in the deepest, safest corners of the massive cavern, were dozens of wide-eyed human children, clutching small toys and watching the towering alien warlords in terrified silence. This was the vulnerable underbelly of the station. The people Silas had prioritized sending to the absolute deepest point of the moon on the very first day. In the center of it all sat Silas Kade. He was resting on a plastic supply crate, casually wiping thick, black grease from his hands with a stained rag. He did not look like a conquered warlord. He looked like a man who had just finished a very long, exhausting shift at a factory. Sarek demanded unconditional surrender, his voice booming through his helmet amplifier, threatening to slaughter everyone in the room. Silas tossed the rag aside and pointed to a large, flickering analog monitor bolted to the wall behind him. It was displaying a crude, heavily shielded optical feed from orbit. Sarek looked up and watched the live feed of his magnificent, invincible armada. They were completely paralyzed in the raging electromagnetic fog, frantically burning maneuvering thrusters, occasionally colliding with one another in the blinding dark, utterly trapped within the gravity well of the moon. Silas spoke, his voice completely devoid of malice, carrying only the flat, heavy weight of absolute practicality. He looked directly at the glowing visor of the Archmarshal and admitted the truth. He told Sarek that he never possessed the kinetic firepower to destroy the Lhoryn fleet. The brutal, bloody slog through the station corridors, the shifting gravity, the severed residential blocks, the fake command center's every single drop of blood spilled inside Helios Gate had been nothing but a loud, agonizingly painful theater. It was a massive distraction, designed specifically to keep the proud, aggressive alien warlord utterly obsessed with conquering a tiny speck of metal, while Silas quietly re-engineered the entire solar system around him. The desperate final stand was a stage. The true trap encompassed the moon, the eclipse, the stellar storm, and the intricate invisible architecture of the interstellar trade route itself. Silas leaned forward, his eyes locking onto the towering alien. He was not asking for mercy. He was offering a brutal transaction. He told Sarek that he could easily order his troops to slaughter the nurses, the engineers, and the children in this room. He could claim his bloody, tactical victory on the ground. But if he did, Silas would simply delete the analog safe passage navigation vectors hidden in his terminal. The human architect laid the final, crushing choice at the feet of the Ascendancy. Sarek Vall had to choose, right in that suffocating room, between his own personal, historical pride as a conqueror and the physical survival of 90% of his trapped, blinded armada burning in the sky above. Archmarshal Sarek Vall stood in the sweltering geothermal chamber, the crushing reality of the human trap closing around him. Yet, 10,000 years of Ascendancy pride did not evaporate in a single moment of clarity. His jaw tightened. He refused to be the first supreme commander in their glorious history to capitulate to a species of glorified mechanics, ignoring the horrifying tactical feed on the analog monitor. Sarek raised his gauntlet. He barked a final, desperate order over his local tactical network. He commanded his heavy shock troops to breach the very last reinforced bulkhead, separating them from the hardwired jump gate telemetry hub. If he could capture the physical override, he could manually punch a tunnel through the electromagnetic storm and drag his blinded armada to safety. Silas Kade watched the alien commander make the wrong choice. There was no triumph in the eyes of the human architect, only a profound, exhausting sadness. Silas turned back to his battered terminal and entered the final contingency code. He triggered the emergency spin reversal of the central station hub and simultaneously purged the colossal liquid ballast tanks into the void. The physical reaction was catastrophic. For a fraction of a second, the artificial gravity of Helios Gate zeroed out, lifting the charging Ascendancy elites off the deck plates. Then, the massive station violently lurched, reversing its rotational momentum, while shedding thousands of tons of stabilizing water mass. The corridors, meant to funnel the alien troops into the command center, instantly transformed into a spinning, chaotic centrifuge. The magnificent golden armor of the Lhoryn infantry, designed for elegant, upright warfare, suddenly became a deadly burden. Unable to anchor themselves against the violently shifting vectors, the elite shock troops were thrown against the bulkheads, their heavy suits crushing their own limbs as the station actively rejected them. High above the tortured metal of the moon, the celestial storm reached its apex. The coronal mass ejection slammed fully into the seeded orbital sphere. The invisible cloud of microscopic ore dust caught the electromagnetic fire, igniting into a blinding, raging aurora of static radiation. Aboard the super dreadnought Radiant Mercy, the situation degraded from panic to absolute slaughter. Completely blind and deaf, 3 entire wings of heavy escort cruisers desperately attempted to find the designated jump coordinates. Without the rigid, automated guidance arrays they had relied upon for generations, their pristine formations collapsed. They slammed into one another in the roaring dark. Armor shattered, plasma drives breached, and thousands of elite alien sailors were incinerated in the cold vacuum without ever seeing the enemy that killed them. Down in the geothermal core, the encrypted tactical channels in the helmet of the Archmarshal bled raw audio from the orbital massacre. Sarek Val stood paralyzed, listening to his proud, aristocratic ship captains screaming for escape vectors that Lhoryn doctrine simply could not provide. They were begging for a way out, completely stripped of their honorable composure. Sarek looked away from the monitors and stared at the humans huddled in the corners of the boiling cavern. He looked at the grease on the hands of the architect. In that suffocating heat, the Archmarshal finally understood the terrible truth to his very bones. Humanity did not discard the sacred rules of war out of a savage, barbaric bloodlust. They discarded the rules because, to them, survival was the only absolute law of the universe. Honor was a luxury afforded only to the living. When faced with extinction, a human would turn the sun itself into a knife. As his shock troops prepared to blow the final door, Sarek Val raised his fist and commanded a total, immediate halt. He ordered the vanguard to power down their plasma cutters and lower their kinetic rifles right in the middle of their final charge. The towering alien warlord bowed his head, the golden crest of his helmet catching the dim, flickering light of the subterranean chamber. He officially requested a ceasefire to save the burning remnants of his armada from being buried alongside his own arrogant beliefs. Silas Kade did not hesitate, but he also did not relent. He accepted the ceasefire, but he locked the terms of the surrender into the station mainframe right then and there, staring directly into the glowing optical sensors of the alien commander. There would be an immediate, highly secured repatriation corridor for every single civilian who had fled. There would be an unconditional, immediate exchange of all prisoners of war. A massive section of Helios Gate and its surrounding orbital sphere would be formally demilitarized, and the Lhoryn Ascendancy would sign a binding treaty sharing total control of the lucrative deep space trade routes. Sarek Val had absolutely no leverage. His fleet was burning, and his vanguard was trapped in a spinning maze. He agreed to every single condition. There was no cheering in the geothermal core. No one threw their helmets into the air or wept tears of glorious triumph. The war simply stopped, replaced by the heavy, exhausting reality of survival. The climax of the battle did not belong to a grand declaration of victory. It belonged to a quiet, solitary walk. Silas Kade left the alien commander standing in the heat and began the long, grueling climb up the maintenance ladders toward the devastated upper levels of his station. He walked through corridors slick with freezing foam, past blasted bulkheads and the shattered remnants of the pristine commercial avenues. He did not draft a triumphant speech for the interstellar news networks. Instead, he keyed his radio to the engineering frequency. His voice, hoarse and bone-tired, echoed through the ruined habitat. He ordered the plumbing teams to restore the primary water pressure. He commanded the electrical crews to patch the lighting grids in the residential sectors. He told the medical staff to clear the debris from the infirmary and get the trauma beds ready for the returning population. Finally, he ordered the automated janitorial drones to begin sweeping the glass from the floors of the elementary schools. The battle was over, but the work of keeping his people alive had never stopped. Months later, the scars on Helios Gate were still visible, but the station hummed with the chaotic, stubborn energy of human commerce. The Lhoryn Ascendancy had retreated behind their borders, their pride permanently fractured. But across the wider galaxy, among the sprawling empires and ancient, rigid military councils, a new document began to circulate. It was not a formal treaty or a diplomatic warning. It was an unofficial, highly classified tactical memo, whispered from admiral to admiral in the dark corners of the universe. They called it the Cade Principle. It contained only one central, terrifying directive. Never assume a human settlement is merely a place to conquer. When pushed to the absolute edge of the abyss, they will turn their home into a fortress, a factory, a maze, a shelter, and a lethal trap all at once. Thank you so much for listening to this story today. I would love to know where you are tuning in from, so please drop a comment below and let us share our thoughts together. If you enjoyed the journey, please subscribe to the Sci-Fi Stories channel, like the video, and support us even more by hitting the hype button so this story can reach the ears of many more sci-fi fans around the world.